I don't know when I stopped being myself. Maybe it was when I stopped giving my opinion about what we should eat at home, or when I accepted that my name was no longer on the bank accounts. Or perhaps it was the day my son, Robert, looked at me with boredom and said I didn't understand anything about the modern world. Now I'm here, sitting on the sidewalk of a street I don't know, in a country whose language I barely understand, without a single cent in my pockets, without my phone, without my documents. People walk past me as if I were invisible. Some look at me with pity. Others don't even turn their heads. I'm 67 years old, and I never imagined I would end up like this. 3 days ago, we were at the airport. Robert had insisted so much that we take this family trip. He said it was important for us to spend time together, that we hadn't all gone out in years. His wife, Patricia, was smiling all the time, but that smile never reached her eyes. I was excited. I thought my son was finally including me in his life, that maybe things between us would get better. How naive I was. The flight was long. Robert and Patricia sat together, several rows ahead of me. They didn't turn around once during the whole trip to see how I was. I was in a middle seat, between two strangers who were sleeping. I looked out the window whenever I could, watching the clouds pass, wondering if this time would be different, if this time my son would see me as his mother and not as a burden. We arrived at the hotel at nightfall. It was a modest but clean place. Robert paid for 2 rooms, one for them and one for me. He gave me the key without looking me in the eye and told me to rest, that we would go out early the next day to see the city. I went up to my room, took off my shoes, and sat on the bed. The walls were white and bare. There was a small window that faced an alley. I stayed there, looking at that window, feeling a weight on my chest that I couldn't explain. The next morning I went down to the lobby at 7 o'clock. Robert had told me we would meet at that time. I waited, sitting on one of those worn leather armchairs that cheap hotels have. I waited for an hour, then 2. Finally, I went up to their room and knocked on the door. No one answered. I went back down and asked the receptionist if he had seen my son. The man checked the computer and said something to me in a language I didn't understand well. I repeated Robert's name several times until the receptionist nodded and pointed toward the street. They were gone. I couldn't believe it. I went back up to my room. I looked for my phone, but it wasn't there. I checked my purse 3 times. I checked every drawer, under the bed, in the bathroom. Nothing. Then I remembered that the night before, Robert had asked for my phone. He said he needed to verify something about the return flights. I gave it to him without thinking. He never gave it back to me. I looked for my wallet. It wasn't there either. I had left it on the nightstand before going to sleep. Someone had entered my room while I was sleeping. I ran down to the lobby. I explained it to the receptionist as best I could. He looked at me with confusion, and then with something like compassion. He called someone on the phone. A woman who spoke a little Spanish arrived. I told her everything. She told me my son had only paid for 1 night of lodging for me. That checkout was at 11 o'clock in the morning. It was 10:30. I had 30 minutes left before they threw me out on the street. I begged her to help me, to call the police, to do something. She shook her head and told me that without documents, she couldn't do anything, that I needed to go to my country's consulate. I asked her where it was. She gave me an address written on a piece of paper. I looked at it without understanding. I had no money for a taxi. I had no way to get there. The woman looked at me sadly and walked away. At 11 o'clock sharp, the receptionist asked me to leave the hotel. I went out into the street wearing the clothes I had on: beige pants, a white blouse, and a grey cardigan that Robert had given me years ago. My shoes were worn. I started walking aimlessly, trying to find something familiar, someone who spoke my language. The streets were wide and clean. There were stores with signs I couldn't read, coffee shops full of young people looking at their phones. I kept walking, feeling the midday sun burn my skin. After walking for hours, I reached a small square. There was a coffee shop on the corner with a few tables outside. I sat on a bench near there. Not inside the coffee shop because I knew they would ask me to order something and I had nothing to pay with. I stayed on that bench, watching people pass. Happy families, couples holding hands, children running after pigeons. I was just an old woman sitting alone, invisible to everyone. I don't know how much time passed. The sun began to set. I was hungry. I was thirsty. But more than that, I was afraid. I didn't know where I would sleep that night. I didn't know what I would do the next day. I thought about Robert, about how he had planned all of this, about how he had brought me here just to abandon me. And for the first time in many years, I felt something stronger than sadness. I felt rage, a deep, silent rage that ran through my entire body. But I also felt something else. I felt that maybe this was a sign, that maybe God was showing me something. I didn't know what, but something inside me was saying that I shouldn't give up, that there was still something to do, something to discover. I wiped away the tears I didn't know were falling and took a deep breath. I was going to survive this. I didn't know how, but I would. Night fell completely and the lights of the coffee shop came on. I was still there, sitting on that bench, watching my life pass before my eyes like an old, blurry movie. A movie where I was only a supporting character in my own story. While I was sitting on that bench, watching the night fall over a city that wasn't mine, my mind began to travel backward, to the years that brought me here, to all the times I said yes when I should have said no, to all the moments when I made myself small so others could feel big. Robert was born when I was 25. His father died when he was barely 8. A work accident that left just my son and me, trying to survive on a miserable pension. I worked at whatever I could. I cleaned houses during the day and sewed clothes at night. My hands always smelled of bleach, and my fingers had permanent marks from the needles. But Robert never lacked anything. Never. I put him in good schools. I skipped meals to pay for his uniforms and books. When his classmates went to birthday parties with expensive gifts, I came up with any excuse to buy something presentable. Robert studied well. He was smart. Everyone said he would go far. And I clung to that idea as if it were my salvation, as if his achievements could erase my exhaustion. When he finished college, he got a good job. He started earning money. I was still cleaning houses because my pension wasn't enough for the rent. He told me to stop working, that he would help me. But his help came with conditions that I didn't understand then. He gave me money, yes, but he always made me feel like it was charity, that I should be grateful, that without him, I would be nothing. He met Patricia when he was 30. She came from a family with money. Her parents had properties, businesses. Robert was dazzled by that world. He started to change. He stopped visiting me as much. When he did, he talked to me about investments, stocks, opportunities that I would never understand. I just nodded, feeling stupider, more out of place, every time. They got married in an expensive ceremony. I sat in the front row in a dress I had bought at a thrift store. No one noticed. Or maybe they did, but no one said anything. During the reception, Patricia's parents talked about trips to Europe, their beach houses, million-dollar investments. I remained silent all night, feeling that I didn't belong there, that I never would. A year after the wedding, Robert came to visit me. He brought papers. He told me there was an incredible investment opportunity, but that he needed my help. I had a small apartment that I had bought with my life savings. It was the only thing in my name. Robert explained that if I put the apartment up as collateral, he could access a large loan and multiply the money. He promised me that in 6 months he would give me everything back with profits. I signed. I signed without reading properly. I signed because he was my son and because I trusted him, because I thought he was finally including me in his plans, that he finally saw me as someone useful. 6 months passed, then a year, then 2. Every time I asked him about the apartment, Robert told me everything was under control, that the investment was maturing, that we would have results soon. Meanwhile, I kept paying rent. I was still living in a small room in an old building. Robert gave me some money every month, $500, sometimes $600. He told me that was all he could give me because his expenses were high. He and Patricia had moved to a big house in an exclusive neighborhood. They had 2 new cars. They traveled constantly. But for me, there was only $500 a month, and the promise that someday I would get my apartment back. Patricia never liked me. I knew it from the beginning. When they came to visit me, she sat on the edge of the chair, as if she was afraid of getting dirty. She checked her phone all the time. She sighed with annoyance every time I spoke. Robert always defended her. He said she was tired, that she had a lot of work, that I should understand her. I understood. I understood that I was surplus to their lives. 3 years ago, Robert told me he could no longer give me money every month, that his expenses had increased. He offered me a solution, to come live with them. They had a utility room at the back of the house, small, windowless, but it was something. I accepted because I had no other option. I sold my few pieces of furniture. I packed my clothes in 2 suitcases and moved into that dark, musty-smelling room. The rules came immediately. I couldn't use the kitchen when they were there. I couldn't have visitors. I couldn't make noise after 9 o'clock at night. I had to keep my room always closed because they were bothered by seeing my things. Patricia left me lists of chores every morning. Wash the dishes, clean the bathrooms, fold the laundry. I became their housekeeper, but without a salary. Robert acted as if everything was normal, as if I should be grateful for having a roof over my head. And maybe I was. Maybe there was something broken inside me that made me believe I deserved that treatment, that after everything I had done for him, this was fair, that I was a burden and had to pay for existing. I stopped going out. I stopped seeing my few friends. I was ashamed to tell them how I lived. I stopped going to church on Sundays because I didn't have decent clothes. I became a ghost in that house. I walked the halls in silence. I ate the leftovers from the refrigerator. I slept in that windowless room, dreaming of a life I would no longer have. 6 months ago, I heard Robert and Patricia talking in the living room. I was in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes. They thought I couldn't hear them, but their voices carried through the thin walls. Patricia was saying that she couldn't stand having me there anymore, that I was a problem, that they needed that room for other things. Robert agreed with her. He said he had a plan, that they would get rid of me soon. I didn't understand what that meant then. I didn't want to understand it. I kept washing the dishes, feeling my hands tremble under the cold water. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the darkness of my room, staring at the ceiling, wondering when I had lost everything. My dignity, my autonomy, my right to exist without apologizing for it. 2 weeks later, Robert announced the trip. He said he wanted to make amends, that he had been hard on me and that I deserved a vacation. Patricia was smiling beside him, but that smile gave me the chills. I wanted to believe. I wanted to believe that my son still loved me, that there was still something left of the boy I used to tell stories to before bed. That boy who hugged me and told me that when he grew up, he would buy me a huge house. Now I am here, abandoned in a foreign country, and I finally understand. The plan was always this: to bring me far away, to take everything from me, to leave me alone. And probably while I am sitting on this bench feeling the night cold chill my bones, Robert is back home, selling my apartment, taking the last thing I had left. The night grew colder. I was still sitting on that bench, hugging myself, trying to maintain some warmth. The lights of the coffee shop were still on, but there were fewer people inside now. A waiter came out to collect the cups from the outside tables and glanced at me. He didn't say anything. He simply finished his job and went back inside. My whole body ached. I hadn't eaten anything all day. My stomach was making noises that embarrassed me. I thought about going into the coffee shop and asking for a glass of water, but I didn't dare. I didn't want to be thrown out. I didn't want any more rejection that day, so I stayed there, watching the few people who were still walking through the square. That's when I saw her. A young girl, perhaps 20 years old, was standing on the opposite corner. She was wearing a light green dress and her long hair fell over her shoulders. But what caught my attention most was her face. She was crying. It wasn't quiet crying. It was a desperate crying, the kind that shakes your whole body. She looked at her phone, then looked around, and started crying again. Something inside me stirred. Despite my own pain, despite my own desperate situation, I couldn't ignore her. I got up from the bench. My legs were numb from sitting so long. I walked towards her slowly. When I was close, she looked at me with red, swollen eyes. I tried to speak to her in Spanish. I asked her if she was okay, if she needed help. She shook her head and spoke to me in that language I didn't understand. But pain is universal. You don't need words to recognize it. I made gestures with my hands, trying to communicate. I pointed to her phone. She held it up in front of me. The screen was cracked, completely shattered. It didn't work. The girl showed me a crumpled piece of paper she took from her purse. There was an address written on it. She pointed to the paper and then pointed around, as if to say she was lost, that she didn't know how to get to that place. I took the paper and looked at it. I didn't understand the language, but I recognized the name of a street. It was the same street I had seen written on several signs while walking aimlessly. I gestured for her to follow me. She hesitated for a moment, looking at me suspiciously. I was just an old, disheveled woman who had spent the whole day on the streets. I didn't look reliable, but maybe she saw something in my eyes. Maybe she saw that I was also broken. Maybe that's why she decided to follow me. We walked together through the empty streets. I was checking the signs, trying to get my bearings. My memory wasn't perfect, but something inside me was guiding me. The girl walked silently beside me. She wasn't crying anymore, but her breathing was still choppy. Every now and then she looked at me as if wondering if she had made the right decision to trust me. After walking for 20 minutes, we reached a different area. The houses here were bigger. The lawns were perfectly maintained. There were high fences and security cameras on every corner. I checked the house numbers, comparing them to the number written on the paper. The girl walked slower now, looking around as if she recognized the place. Finally, we arrived in front of a huge gate. Behind it stood a house that couldn't be called a house. It was a mansion. 3 stories of modern architecture, with huge windows lit from inside. There was a garden that looked like it was straight out of a magazine. Water fountains, sculptures, perfectly trimmed trees. The girl saw the house and started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief. She ran toward the gate and pressed a button on the intercom. She spoke quickly in her language. Seconds later, the gate began to open. An older man ran out of the house. Grey hair. An elegant suit even at that time of night. He was shouting the girl's name. When he reached her, he hugged her with a force that made me remember what it feels like to be loved by a father. The girl pointed toward where I was standing. The man turned to look at me. He approached, walking quickly. I instinctively took a step back. I didn't know what to expect. He spoke to me in that foreign language, but his tone was warm, kind. The girl explained something to him, pointing at me, pointing at the paper with the address. The man nodded as he listened. Then he did something I didn't expect. He bowed slightly in front of me as a sign of respect and took my hands. His hands were soft, warm. Mine were cold and rough. He spoke to me slowly, as if I might understand if he spoke slower. I could only smile and shake my head. I didn't understand anything. A woman came out of the house, also older, with her hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She was wearing a cream-colored silk robe. She ran to the girl and hugged her too. Then she looked at me. Her eyes filled with tears. She came closer and hugged me. I stood rigid for a moment. I didn't remember the last time someone had hugged me like that. With genuine gratitude. With warmth. The man gestured for me to enter the house. I shook my head. I didn't want to be a bother. I had done what I needed to do. The girl was safe. I could leave. But he insisted. He took my arm gently and guided me toward the house. The woman walked on the other side, smiling at me, saying things that I didn't understand, but that sounded kind. We entered the house, and I stopped in the foyer. Everything was too much. The floor was white marble. There was a curved staircase that led up to the second floor. Huge paintings hung on the walls. Crystal lamps hung from the ceiling. I looked at my dirty shoes and felt ashamed. I didn't belong in that place. The woman led me to a huge living room. There were beige leather sofas that looked like they had never been used. A fireplace took up an entire wall. She made me sit on one of the sofas. I sat on the edge, afraid of getting anything dirty. The man said something to the girl, and she ran off toward another part of the house. The woman sat across from me. She looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. She pointed to me, and then made a gesture as if eating. I nodded. I was so hungry my stomach hurt. She got up and left the room. The man remained standing, looking at me. I looked down. I didn't know what to do with so much attention. The girl returned with a soft blanket. She put it over my shoulders. It was warm, as if she had put it in a dryer before bringing it. The warmth enveloped me, and I felt my body could finally relax. The woman came back with a tray. There was a steaming bowl of chicken noodle soup, freshly baked cornbread, and a glass of water. She placed everything on the table in front of me. I looked at the bowl, and the tears began to fall. I couldn't control them. All the tension of the day, all the fear, all the humiliation came out suddenly. I cried in front of these strangers who had welcomed me into their home without knowing me. The woman sat beside me and hugged me again. She didn't say anything. She just let me cry. When I finally calmed down, I picked up the spoon with trembling hands and ate. The soup was delicious, hot, comforting. Each spoonful gave me back a little bit of humanity. The bread was soft and sweet. I ate slowly, trying not to look desperate, although I was. They watched me eat with kind smiles. When I finished, the man sat across from me. He took out his phone and opened a translation app. He wrote something and showed me the screen. In Spanish, it read, "What is your name?" I took the phone and wrote my name. Mary Rodriguez. He read it and nodded. He wrote again, "I am Mr. Wilson. This is my wife, Mrs. Wilson. Our daughter is Olivia." I nodded. Olivia was smiling at me from the other sofa. Mr. Wilson wrote another question. Why are you alone on the street? I looked at that question for a long time. I didn't know if I should tell them the truth. I didn't know if they would believe me. But something in their faces told me I could trust them. That maybe, for the first time in a long time, someone really cared about me. I took the phone and started writing. My fingers trembled as I wrote on that phone. I told them everything. How my son had brought me to this country with the promise of a family vacation. How he had taken my phone and wallet while I was sleeping. How they had abandoned me at the hotel without money, without documents, without anything. I told them I had been on the streets all day without knowing what to do or where to go. Mr. Wilson read every word with a frown. When I finished writing, he passed the phone to Mrs. Wilson. She read it and put a hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears again. Olivia also read it and looked at me with deep sadness. The three of them looked at each other and started talking in their language. I could only watch them, trying to understand from their gestures and expressions what they were saying. Mr. Wilson took the phone again and wrote, "You are staying here tonight. Tomorrow we will help you." I shook my head. It had been enough of a bother. They had given me food and warmth. I couldn't ask for more. But Mrs. Wilson placed her hand on mine and firmly shook her head. Mr. Wilson wrote again, "It's no bother. It's the right thing to do. You saved our daughter." I didn't know what to say. I could only nod as more tears rolled down my cheeks. Mrs. Wilson helped me get up from the sofa. My legs barely responded from exhaustion. She guided me toward the stairs, and we went up to the second floor. The hallway was wide, with soft carpets under my feet. There were family photos on the walls. Olivia at different ages. Trips. Celebrations. A happy family. Mrs. Wilson opened a door, and we entered a room that was bigger than the entire room I had lived in for the last 3 years. There was a huge bed with impeccable white sheets, large windows with thick curtains, a private bathroom that I could see from the entrance. Mrs. Wilson showed me everything. She pointed out where the towels, soap, and shampoo were. Everything new, everything clean. She left me alone after giving me one more hug. I closed the door and stood in the middle of that room for several minutes. I couldn't believe what was happening. A few hours ago, I was sitting on a bench, cold and hungry, thinking that maybe this would be my last night. And now I was here, in this beautiful house, with people who treated me with more dignity than my own son had given me in years. I went into the bathroom. It was all white marble with gold accents. There was a large bathtub and a separate shower. I turned on the shower water and waited for it to warm up. I took off the clothes I had worn all day. I looked at myself in the mirror. A 67-year-old woman with deep dark circles looked back at me. My hair was messy and greasy. My skin looked pale and blotchy. I had aged so much in such a short time. The hot water fell over my body, and it was as if I was washing away not only the dirt of the day, but years of humiliation. I cried in the shower. I cried for everything I had lost. For the mother I was and no longer recognized. For the years I had dedicated to a son who had now discarded me like trash. But I also cried with relief, because in the midst of all this horror, I had found kindness in unexpected places. I stepped out of the shower and wrapped myself in a towel so soft it felt like a cloud. There was a nightgown folded on the bed. It was white cotton with small embroidered flowers. I took it carefully and put it on. It was a little big on me, but it was comfortable and smelled of lavender. I got under the sheets, and my body sank into the softest mattress I had ever slept on in my life. I turned off the light and stared at the ceiling. In the darkness, my mind began to process everything that had happened. Robert's betrayal, the abandonment, but also This miracle. Because that's what it was. A miracle. If I hadn't helped Olivia, I would be sleeping on the street right now. Or maybe I wouldn't be sleeping. Maybe something worse would have happened to me. I thought about my apartment, about that small place I had bought with so much sacrifice, and that Robert had taken from me with lies. I thought about how I had signed those papers trusting him, about how he never gave me anything back. Now I understood that he never would, that he had probably already sold it, that this was probably the real reason for this trip, to take me away so I couldn't stop him. I fell asleep with those bitter thoughts, but also with a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, I was in a place where I felt safe. I woke up with the sun streaming through the windows. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then I remembered everything. I got up slowly and opened the curtains. The view was beautiful. A huge garden stretched out behind the house. There were fruit trees, flowers of all colours, and a swimming pool that glittered under the morning light. Someone knocked softly on the door. It was Mrs. Wilson. She entered with a smile and motioned for me to follow her. We went down to the dining room. It was a room with a long, dark wood table. Mr. Wilson was already there, reading the newspaper. He stood up when he saw me and pointed to a chair. Olivia arrived a few minutes later, still in her pajamas, with messy hair but a smile on her face. The table was full of food: freshly baked biscuits, fruit, juice, eggs, cheese. More food than I had seen together in months. Mrs. Wilson served me a plate and urged me to eat. I ate slowly, still feeling out of place, but also grateful. After breakfast, Mr. Wilson took out his phone again. He wrote, "Today we are going to the consulate. You need new documents." I nodded. That was exactly what I needed. Without documents, I didn't exist. I couldn't travel, I couldn't ask for help, I couldn't do anything. Mr. Wilson wrote more. "I know people there. They will help you quickly." We got into a black, elegant car. Mr. Wilson was driving, Mrs. Wilson was in the passenger seat, and I was in the back with Olivia. As we drove through the city, I looked out the window. Everything looked different in the daylight. The streets that had seemed threatening at night were now full of life. People walking, open stores, children going to school. We arrived at the consulate after 30 minutes. It was a large building with my country's flag waving at the entrance. Seeing that flag made me feel something strange, a mixture of relief and pain. Mr. Wilson accompanied me inside. He spoke to the receptionist in his language and then in basic Spanish. She told us to wait. It wasn't long before they called us. A middle-aged woman received us in her office. She spoke perfect Spanish. I told her my whole story. She listened, taking notes. When I finished, she sighed deeply and told me that cases like mine were more common than I thought. That many older adults were abandoned by their families in foreign countries. She asked me several questions. What was my full name? Where was I born? Names of my parents, my previous address. I answered as best I could. Some details I remembered clearly. Others were blurry. She told me they would do their best to issue a temporary document that would allow me to return home. Mr. Wilson intervened. He spoke to the woman in that language I didn't understand. She nodded as she listened. Then she looked at me and said, "Mr. Wilson is offering to cover all the expenses for your return ticket and any administrative costs that arise." I looked at Mr. Wilson with tears in my eyes. He just smiled and nodded. We left the consulate with the promise that my temporary documents would be ready in 3 days, 3 more days in this foreign country. But now I had hope. I had a way back home. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson had given me that. In the car on the way back, Mr. Wilson made an unexpected stop. We stopped in front of a clothing store. Mrs. Wilson took my arm and made me go in. I protested, telling her it wasn't necessary, but she didn't listen to me. They had me try on several outfits: pants, blouses, a jacket, new shoes, underwear. Mrs. Wilson paid for everything without hesitation. When we returned to the house, they took me to the same living room where I had been the night before. Mr. Wilson sat across from me with his phone. He wrote, "Tell me more about your son, about your house. I need to know everything." I hesitated. I didn't want to involve them any further. They had already done too much. But the way he looked at me told me this was important to him. So I told him everything. I told him about the apartment I had bought, how Robert had made me sign it as collateral, how he never gave it back to me. I told him about the 3 years living in that dark room, working as an unpaid servant. I told him every detail I remembered. Mr. Wilson wrote and wrote. He asked specific questions. He wanted dates, full names, exact addresses. I gave him all the information I could remember. When we finished, he put away his phone and looked at me with a serious expression. He wrote one last thing. "I am going to help you get back what is yours." The next 2 days were strange for me. Living in that house was like being in a dream I didn't want to wake up from. Mrs. Wilson treated me like I was part of the family. She made me sit with them during meals. She showed me the garden and told me stories that I barely understood, but that I listened to attentively because of the warmth of her voice. Olivia taught me words in her language and laughed when I mispronounced them. Mr. Wilson spent many hours in his office, a room on the first floor full of books and a large computer. I saw him go in and out with papers in his hands, talking on the phone with people. Sometimes he called me and asked me more questions about Robert, about the apartment, about the papers I had signed. I answered everything as best I could, although I didn't fully understand why he needed so much information. On the afternoon of the second day, Mr. Wilson asked me to sit with him in his office. He had that serious expression that I had seen before. He opened his computer and showed me the screen. He had found public property records in my city. And there it was, my apartment, the one I had bought so many years ago with the sweat of my brow. But the name that appeared as the owner was no longer mine. It was Robert Marquez. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. Seeing that written, official, real, took my breath away. Mr. Wilson wrote on his phone, "Your son registered the apartment in his name 2 years ago. He used a forged deed." I knew something like this had happened, but seeing it confirmed was different. It made it real in a way that hurt me to the bone. Mr. Wilson continued writing, "I know lawyers in your state. Good lawyers. I also know people who can investigate this further." I looked at him without being able to speak. This man who barely knew me, who had only seen me 2 days ago, was doing more for me than my own son had done in years. I asked him why. Why was he doing all this for a stranger? He took his time to write the answer. "When I was your son's age, my father was scammed by his business partner. It left him ruined. No one helped him. He died alone and poor 2 years later. I was young then. I didn't have the resources to help him. I promised that if I ever could help someone in a similar situation, I would. You are giving me that opportunity." I read those words for 3 times. There was so much pain in them, but also so much determination. I understood then that Mr. Wilson wasn't helping me just out of kindness. He was helping me for his father, for that promise he had made. I was the opportunity to redeem something he couldn't do before, and I was going to accept that help with all my gratitude. That night, after dinner, Mr. Wilson made several calls. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to read a magazine, but actually listening to his voice on the phone. I didn't understand his words, but the tone was firm, confident. He spoke like someone who was used to being listened to, like someone with power. When he finished, he came and showed me his phone. He had written, "Tomorrow you pick up your documents, then we fly to your city. I'm going with you." I shook my head. I couldn't let him do that. He had already done too much. But he insisted. He wrote, "You need witnesses, you need support, and I need to make sure everything is resolved correctly." Mrs. Wilson appeared at that moment and put her hand on my shoulder. She smiled at me in that way that was already familiar to me, a smile that said everything was going to be all right. The next day we went to the consulate. The same woman as before greeted us with a smile. She handed me an envelope with my temporary document, a simple piece of paper that gave me back my identity. I held it in my hands and felt like I was recovering a piece of myself. She also gave me a copy of my birth certificate that they had requested from my country's records. Documents that proved who I was. Documents that Robert couldn't erase. Mr. Wilson bought the plane tickets right there from his phone. 2 seats for the next morning's flight. I kept thanking him, but the words felt insufficient. How do you thank someone who saved your life without knowing you? How do you thank someone who gave you back hope when you had nothing left? That night was my last in the Wilsons' house. Mrs. Wilson prepared a special dinner. They set the table with elegant tablecloths and fresh flowers in the centre. Olivia came down in a pretty dress, and even I put on one of the new blouses Mrs. Wilson had bought me. We ate, and although I didn't understand everything they were saying, I laughed when they laughed. I felt like I was part of something, of a family, of a true family. After dinner, Mrs. Wilson took me aside. She handed me an envelope. I opened it and there was money inside. New bills. I quickly counted. $2,000. I tried to give it back to her. It was too much. But she closed my hands over the envelope and shook her head. She wrote on Mr. Wilson's phone, which she always kept nearby, "So you can start over, so you never have to depend on anyone else." I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed awake staring at the ceiling of that beautiful room, thinking about everything that had happened. A week ago, I was a broken woman, living in a windowless room, serving my son's family as a voiceless maid. 4 days ago, I was abandoned in a foreign country, sitting on a bench without hope. And now I was here, with new documents, money in my purse, and a powerful man willing to help me get back what was mine. The next morning we got up early. Mrs. Wilson prepared breakfast, while Mr. Wilson loaded a small suitcase into the car. I only had the bag with the clothes Mrs. Wilson had bought me. It was all I had in the world, but it was more than I had had in a long time. Olivia came down still in her pajamas to say goodbye. She hugged me tightly and whispered something to me in her language. I don't know what she said, but it sounded like a blessing. The drive to the airport was silent. I looked out the window, memorizing the streets of this city that I had known under the worst circumstances, but that now held my best recent memories. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson were in the front, holding hands. I realized in that moment what a real marriage was. 2 people who supported each other, who made decisions together, who respected each other. The complete opposite of what Robert and Patricia had. At the airport, Mrs. Wilson hugged me for a long time. I felt her tears on my neck and mine falling onto her shoulder. We didn't need words. Love and gratitude communicated in that hug. When we finally separated, she put something in my hand. It was a small silver necklace with a tiny medal, a Virgin Mary. I put it around my neck immediately. Mr. Wilson and I went through security. He carried his suitcase and I carried my bag. In the waiting area, Mr. Wilson opened his computer and showed me more documents he had obtained. He had hired a private investigator in my city. In just 2 days, that investigator had discovered things that chilled my blood. Robert had sold my apartment 6 months ago for $200,000. The money had gone directly into his bank account. But that wasn't all. He had also tried to collect my pension, impersonating my legal representative. He had forged my signature on multiple documents. He had declared to the authorities that I was mentally incapacitated and that he was my legal guardian. I read all of that with trembling hands. My own son had erased me from the map. He had stolen everything from me, and then declared me incompetent so I couldn't defend myself. And the final plan had been to abandon me abroad so I could never return to claim anything. It was a perfect plan. Cruel, but perfect. Mr. Wilson wrote, "We have all the evidence, forgery of documents, theft, fraud. It is enough for a strong legal case." I nodded as I read, but inside I felt a huge emptiness. It wasn't just about the money or the apartment. It was about realizing how far Robert had gone to get rid of me. His own mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. We boarded the plane. Mr. Wilson had first-class seats. I had never flown first class. The seats were huge and comfortable. The flight attendants offered us champagne before takeoff. I asked for water. During the flight, Mr. Wilson worked on his computer. I looked at the clouds outside the window, mentally preparing myself for what was to come. We landed in my city 12 hours later, at night. The airport looked the same as always, dirty, noisy, chaotic. But it was my chaos, my city, my country. I felt something strange upon stepping onto familiar ground, a mixture of relief and anxiety. I was home, but home was no longer what it had been. Mr. Wilson had reserved rooms in a hotel near downtown. It wasn't as luxurious as his house, but it was clean and comfortable. He left me in my room and told me to rest, that tomorrow everything would begin. I sat on the bed and looked around. A hotel room in my own city. A month ago I was sleeping in a windowless room. A week ago in a mansion. Today in a hotel. My life had become a series of temporary rooms. But soon I would have something permanent. Something mine. I would get it back. I woke up early the next morning. I hadn't slept well. All night I kept thinking about what was coming, about having to face Robert, about having to see his face after what he had done to me. Mr. Wilson knocked on my door at 8 o'clock. We had breakfast in the hotel restaurant. Coffee, toast, fruit. I could barely eat. My nerves tied my stomach in knots. After breakfast, the lawyer Mr. Wilson had hired arrived. His name was James Dixon. He was a man about 50 years old, with a grey suit and a worn leather briefcase. He had a serious, but not cold, look. He sat with us in the hotel lobby and spread several papers on the table. He explained everything he had discovered to me in clear Spanish. Robert had used a false power of attorney to register the apartment in his name. He had forged my signature on at least 5 different documents. The notary who had certified those documents was known to be corrupt. There were multiple complaints against him, but he was still working because he had political contacts. James showed me copies of the false documents. Seeing my signature there, imitated but clearly not done by me, turned my stomach. Robert had practiced my signature. He had studied every curve, every dot. He had dedicated time to learning how to falsify me. That required premeditation. It required pure malice. The lawyer told me that we had a very strong case, but that we would need to act quickly. Robert might try to flee or hide more assets if he found out I had returned. We needed to surprise him. James had already prepared a formal complaint with the district attorney's office. He just needed my signature, my real signature this time. I signed every paper he put in front of me. My hand trembled, but the signature came out clearly. James collected everything and told me that in 2 hours we would have a court order to freeze all of Robert's bank accounts. He would also request an arrest warrant for fraud and forgery of documents. He told me this was only the beginning. Mr. Wilson had been listening to everything in silence. Now he spoke to the lawyer in basic Spanish. He asked him how long the whole process would take. James replied that if everything went well, in 3 months we could have a sentence. 3 months to get back what was mine. Teacher. 3 months for justice to be served. After the lawyer left, Mr. Wilson and I remained seated in the lobby. I felt exhausted, even though the day was just beginning. Mr. Wilson showed me his phone. He had written, "Do you want to go see your old apartment?" I hesitated. I didn't know if I was ready to see that place that had been mine and that now belonged to someone else. But I also needed to see it. I needed to remember why I was doing all this. We took a taxi. I gave the address to the driver. It was an old building in a middle-class neighborhood. Nothing luxurious, but it had been mine. I had bought it with the savings from 20 years of work. Every cent I had paid for it had come from my tired hands, from my sleepless nights, sewing clothes for other people. We got out of the taxi and stood in front of the building. It hadn't changed much. The paint was still the same worn cream color. The balconies had the same rusty iron railings. I looked up at the 3rd floor, where my apartment was. The windows had new curtains. Someone else lived there now. We entered the building. The doorman was the same as always. Mr. Raymond, a 70-year-old man who had been working there since before I bought my apartment. He recognized me immediately. His eyes widened in surprise, and then with something like shame. He approached me slowly. He asked me where I had been. I told him it was a long story. He lowered his voice and told me he had seen when they came to empty my apartment, that Robert had brought a truck and taken all my furniture, my things, everything, that other people had come afterward to clean and paint, that a young couple who paid rent to Robert lived there now. I asked him if Robert came often. Mr. Raymond nodded. He said he came every beginning of the month to collect the rent, that he always arrived in his new car, well dressed as if he owned the world. I felt the rage rise in my throat. Robert was collecting rent from my apartment. He was getting rich from what was mine. I thanked Mr. Raymond for the information. He took my hand and told me he had always known that something wasn't right, that I wasn't the type of person who just abandons her things like that he was glad to see me back. His words gave me strength. At least someone in this building had noticed my absence. We went out into the street again. Mr. Wilson looked at me with a question in his eyes. I just nodded. I was ready for what was next. We walked until we found a coffee shop. We sat near the window. Mr. Wilson ordered 2 coffees. I watched the people walk by on the street. My people. My city. Everything felt familiar and strange at the same time. Mr. Wilson opened his computer. He showed me a plan he had designed. First, we would wait for the district attorney's office to execute the orders. That would happen today. Then, we would go directly to Robert's house, not to confront him yet, but to serve a legal notice. He wanted Robert to know that I had returned, that I knew everything, that I wouldn't give up. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, James called us. Everything was ready. Robert's accounts had been frozen. The arrest warrant was issued, but it wouldn't be executed until we decided. The lawyer wanted to give Robert the opportunity to turn himself in voluntarily. He said that could work in our favor in court, show that he cooperated with justice. I wasn't sure I wanted to give him that opportunity. Robert hadn't given me any opportunity. But Mr. Wilson and James insisted. They said it was the smartest move, that it would make us look like the reasonable victims we were, that the judge would see that. I accepted, although every part of me wanted to see Robert arrested immediately. We arrived at Robert's house at sunset. That big house in the exclusive neighborhood where I had lived in a dark room for the last 3 years. Mr. Wilson parked the rented car in front of the gate. I stayed seated, looking at that house I knew so well. Every window, every tree in the yard, every stone on the driveway. Mr. Wilson got out of the car first. I followed him with trembling legs. We walked to the gate and Mr. Wilson pressed the intercom button. No one answered for a moment. Then I heard Patricia's voice. She sounded annoyed. She asked who it was. Mr. Wilson replied in basic Spanish that he had legal documents for Robert Marquez. There was a long silence. Then Robert's voice. He sounded tense. He said he wasn't taking visitors. Mr. Wilson calmly replied that he could receive the documents now or wait for the police to come and deliver them formally. Another silence. Finally, the gate began to open. We walked along that path I had walked thousands of times, but now it was different. Now I was not going as the submissive mother who lived there out of charity. I was going as what I was. The owner of stolen property, a woman who had come to claim what was hers. The house door opened. Robert was there. He looked the same as always, tall, well-dressed, with that air of superiority he had always had. But when he saw me, his face changed. First surprise, then fear, then something like fury. He looked at me as if I were a ghost, as if I shouldn't be there. Patricia appeared behind him. She saw me too, and her mouth dropped open. Neither of them said anything for a moment. They just stood there, looking at me, trying to process that I had returned, that their perfect plan had failed, that the woman they had abandoned in a foreign country was standing in front of their door. Mr. Wilson broke the silence. He held out an envelope to Robert. My son took it with trembling hands. He opened it right there and started reading. I watched as his face grew paler and paler. When he finished reading, he looked me in the eye for the first time. And in that look, I saw everything. Guilt, fear, but also hatred. Hatred because I had ruined his plan. He tried to speak. He tried to say something. But Mr. Wilson raised his hand. He told him in slow Spanish to read the entire document before saying anything. That he had 24 hours to voluntarily present himself to the district attorney's office with his lawyer. That if he didn't, he would be arrested. That his accounts were already frozen. That the evidence of his fraud was irrefutable. Robert looked at me again. This time he tried to approach. He tried to say my name, but I took a step back. I didn't want him to touch me. I didn't want to hear his excuses. Mr. Wilson stood between us, protective. He told Robert that any communication from now on had to be through the lawyers. We turned around and walked back to the gate. I could feel Robert's eyes fixed on my back. I heard Patricia scream something from the door. I didn't understand what she said, but the tone was panic. The gate closed behind us and we got into the car. My hands were trembling so much I couldn't fasten my seatbelt. Mr. Wilson did it for me. As we drove away from that house, I allowed myself to feel. Everything I had been holding back for days came out suddenly. I cried. I cried like I hadn't cried in years. Mr. Wilson didn't say anything. He just drove in silence, letting me release all the pain. When I finally calmed down, he looked at me and nodded. He didn't need words. That gesture said it all. We were going to win this. I spent the whole night awake in my hotel room. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Robert's face when he saw me standing in front of his door. That mixture of terror and rage. I knew the next few hours would be decisive. Robert would have to decide whether to turn himself in voluntarily or run away. Part of me hoped he would run away, that he would show his true cowardice. But another part wanted to see him face what he had done. At 7 o'clock in the morning, James called us. Robert had contacted a lawyer. He would present himself to the district attorney's office at 10 o'clock. I felt relief and disappointment at the same time. Relief because I wouldn't have to go through the drama of seeing him arrested. Disappointment because a part of me wanted exactly that. I wanted to see him handcuffed, humiliated, destroyed as he had destroyed me. Mr. Wilson and I arrived at the district attorney's office at 9:30. It was a grey, old building, with long hallways that smelled of wet paper and cheap disinfectant. James was already there, waiting for us with more papers in his briefcase. He explained how everything would work. There would be a preliminary hearing. The prosecutor would present the evidence. Robert would have an opportunity to testify. Afterward, the judge would decide if there was enough evidence to proceed with a formal trial. At 10 o'clock sharp, I saw Robert arrive. He was accompanied by an older man in a black suit. His lawyer, I assumed. Robert didn't look at me as he entered. He kept his eyes straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Patricia was not with him. She had probably stayed home, planning how to salvage what she could of her comfortable life. We entered a small room. There was a long table where the prosecutor sat, a thin man in his 40s with thick glasses. The judge was a middle-aged woman with short hair and an expression that gave nothing away. She instructed us where to sit. I sat on the left side with James and Mr. Wilson. Robert sat on the right with his lawyer. There were barely 10 feet between us, but it felt like an abyss. The prosecutor began to speak. He read the charges aloud. Forgery of documents, fraud, misappropriation, elder abuse. Each word fell like a hammer in the room. Robert remained motionless, looking at the table. His lawyer took notes constantly. Then the prosecutor presented the evidence. He showed the forged documents with my imitated signature. He showed the bank records that proved Robert had received $200,000 for the sale of my apartment. He showed the rental contracts he had signed afterward, collecting $1,000 a month from the new tenants. He showed the false declaration where he declared me mentally incompetent. Each piece of evidence was like a blow, not only for Robert, but for me too. Seeing everything exposed like that, in that cold room, made the level of betrayal real. It hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been a misunderstanding. It had been a calculated plan, executed over years, to steal everything from me and then eliminate me from his life. The judge looked at each document carefully. She asked the prosecutor specific questions: when the documents had been forged, who the notary had been, if there were witnesses. The prosecutor answered everything with precision. They had a solid case. Anyone could see it. When the prosecutor finished, the judge turned to Robert. She asked him if he wanted to testify. Robert's lawyer whispered something in his ear. Robert nodded and stood up. For the first time since we entered the room, he looked directly at me. He began to speak in a trembling voice. He said it had all been a misunderstanding, that I had given him permission to sell the apartment, that I had signed all the documents voluntarily, that he was only looking after my interests because I could no longer do it alone, that the trip had been an accident, that he had returned to the hotel to look for me, but I was no longer there. Every word that came out of his mouth was a lie, a carefully constructed lie. But his voice didn't sound convincing. It trembled too much. His hands moved nervously. Even his lawyer seemed uncomfortable with what he was saying. The judge interrupted him. She asked him why then my signature on the documents didn't match my real signature. Why there was no record of me having been present when those papers were signed. Why he had declared me incompetent without a medical evaluation. Why he had collected money from the sale without giving any to me. Robert stammered, trying to answer. He said the notaries had made mistakes, that the documents had been misplaced, that he thought I had received the money. Each answer sounded more desperate than the last. His lawyer finally touched his arm, signaling him to be quiet. Then James stood up. He asked the judge for permission to present additional evidence. She nodded. My lawyer took more papers from his briefcase. They were records from the last 3 years. They showed that I had lived in Robert's house without receiving any payment, that I had no access to bank accounts, that I had no registered income. He had statements from neighbors confirming that I worked as a housekeeper in that house. Then he presented something I didn't know he had, text messages between Robert and Patricia. They had obtained them with a court order. In those messages, Robert and his wife spoke openly about their plan, about how they would get rid of me, about how much money they would make selling the apartment, about the trip they would use as an excuse to abandon me. The room went silent as the judge read those messages. I read them too from my seat. Seeing the words written by my son was worse than anything I had imagined. In those messages, I was not his mother. I was a problem, an obstacle, something that had to be eliminated. In one of the messages, Robert wrote to Patricia, "In 2 weeks we're rid of her forever. No one will look for her. She has no friends. She has no family. She'll disappear, and no one will ask questions." Patricia replied, "It's about time. I can't stand having her in the house one more day." I felt like I couldn't breathe. Mr. Wilson put his hand on mine, squeezing it gently. James continued speaking, explaining how those messages proved premeditation, how they showed that the abandonment had not been accidental, how Robert had planned every detail of my disappearance. The judge looked up from the papers. She looked at Robert with a harsh expression. She asked him if he had anything to say about those messages. Robert opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lawyer shook his head, clearly defeated. There was no possible defense against that evidence. Robert finally looked at me again. This time there were tears in his eyes. He started to speak, but no longer with the defensive tone from before. Now his voice sounded broken. He said my name. "Mom," he said. It was the first time he had called me that in years. He said he was sorry, that he had made a mistake, that he had been influenced by Patricia, that the money had changed him, that he never wanted to go that far. His words reached me as if from very far away. Part of me wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that something was still left of the child I had raised. But he was no longer that child. He was a man who had stolen from me, who had abandoned me, who had planned my disappearance as one plans to throw away trash. I stood up from my chair. James looked at me surprised, but didn't stop me. I walked toward where Robert was. He looked at me with those teary eyes, waiting for forgiveness, compassion. I stopped in front of him. I looked him in the eyes for a long time. All the pain of the last years was concentrated in that moment. I spoke in a calm but firm voice. I told him I had given him everything, that I had worked until my hands bled so he would never lack anything, that I had gone without eating to buy him books and uniforms, that I had sacrificed my entire life so he could have a future, and that he had repaid me by stealing from me, humiliating me and abandoning me as if I were worthless. I told him that what hurt me the most was not the money or the apartment. It was knowing that all that love I had given him for 42 years had meant nothing to him. that I had been just a means to an end, a source of resources that could be exploited and then discarded. I told him he had had entire days to think about what he had done to me, days when I didn't know if I would survive, days when hunger and cold made me think that maybe it was easier to give up. But I had survived, not for him, but despite him, because I was worth more than he had ever made me feel. Robert was crying openly now. He tried to take my hand, but I pulled it away. I told him that what hurt the most was that I still loved him, that despite everything he had done to me, a part of me would always be his mother, and that I would have to live with that, with loving someone who had destroyed me. I told him I didn't expect him to understand, that he probably never would, but that I needed him to know that this wasn't just about money or property. It was about dignity. It was about justice. It was about teaching him that there are consequences when you destroy the people who love you. I turned around and returned to my seat. The room was completely silent. Even the judge seemed moved. Robert continued crying, his head in his hands. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he didn't seem to hear. The judge took a few minutes to review all the documents again. Then she spoke. She said there was more than enough evidence to proceed with a full trial, that the charges were serious and that premeditation was clearly demonstrated. She set a date for the trial in 2 months. Then she looked at Robert and told him he was released on conditional bail, but he could not leave the state and had to report to the authorities every week. We left the district attorney's office in silence. Mr. Wilson held my arm because my legs were shaking. James was satisfied. He said everything had gone better than expected, that my statement had been powerful, that the trial was practically won. But I didn't feel victory. I only felt a deep emptiness. I had faced my son. I had told him everything I needed to tell him, and now all that was left was to wait for justice to take its course. The next 2 months passed slow and heavy. Mr. Wilson had to return to his country for work matters, but he called me every 2 days to find out how everything was going. Mrs. Wilson also called, using translation apps to ask me how I felt. Their long-distance support kept me standing when everything seemed too difficult. I stayed in the hotel, paying with the money Mrs. Wilson had given me. James visited me regularly to prepare me for the trial. He asked me questions. He taught me how to behave in front of the judge, what to say and what not to say. I memorized every instruction as if my life depended on it, because, in a way, it did. During those weeks, Robert tried to contact me several times. Calls I didn't answer. Messages I deleted without reading. He even came to the hotel one afternoon, but the receptionist stopped him before he could go up to my room. I didn't want to see him. Not until we were in front of the judge again. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, even though the hearing wasn't until 10. I took a cold shower to wake myself up completely. I put on one of the outfits Mrs. Wilson had bought me, black pants and a cream-colored blouse. Nothing ostentatious. I wanted to look like what I was. An older woman who had been a victim of abuse and was now seeking justice. James picked me up at 8 o'clock. In the car, he explained again how everything would be. The prosecutor would present the complete case. There would be witnesses, experts who would confirm the signatures were false. In the end, I would have to testify. That would be the most important part. My testimony could define the outcome of the trial. The courtroom was full when we arrived. There were people I didn't know. Journalists, James told me. The case had caught the attention of the media. A story of abandonment and family theft always interested the press. I tried not to look at them. I didn't want this to turn into a circus. Robert was already there with his lawyer. He looked haggard. He had lost weight. He had deep, dark circles under his eyes, and his suit looked wrinkled. Patricia was not with him. Apparently, she had filed for divorce as soon as the preliminary hearing began. The rat was abandoning the sinking ship. The judge entered, and we all stood up. It was the same judge from the preliminary hearing. The woman with short hair and a serious expression. She instructed us to sit down, and the trial began. The prosecutor presented everything again. The evidence, the forged documents, the messages between Robert and Patricia, the bank records. Each piece of evidence was presented methodically, building a case impossible to refute. They called the expert who had analyzed the signatures. He confirmed under oath that the signatures on the sale documents were not mine, that they had been forged by someone who knew my signature, but who clearly was not me. They called Mr. Raymond, the doorman of my old building. He testified that he had seen when my apartment was emptied, that I was not present, that Robert had directed everything and had later started collecting rent from the new tenants. They called neighbors from the house where I had lived those last 3 years. They testified that they had seen me working as a housekeeper, that I was never treated like family, that I lived in a separate room and ate separately. Their testimonies painted a clear picture of abuse and exploitation. Robert's lawyer tried to defend the indefensible. He argued that I had given verbal consent for everything, that the documents were a technicality, that the relationship between mother and son was complex and could not be judged by normal rules. But his arguments sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence. Finally, they called me to testify. I walked toward the stand with trembling legs. I put my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. I sat in that high chair, looking at the whole room. Robert kept his gaze lowered. He couldn't look me in the eye. The prosecutor asked me questions. I told him my story from the beginning. How I had raised Robert alone after his father died. How I had worked until I was destroyed to give him a good life. How I had trusted him when he asked me to sign the apartment papers. How that trust had been betrayed. I told him about the 3 years living in that dark room. About how my autonomy had been taken away from me little by little. About the trip I thought would be a reconciliation, but which was actually my death sentence. About waking up in that hotel with nothing. About walking on foreign streets without knowing if I would survive. My voice broke several times. Tears fell without me being able to stop them. But I didn't stop talking. I needed everyone in that room to know what they had done to me. I needed Robert to hear every word of my pain. Robert's lawyer tried to cross-examine me. He asked me if it wasn't true that I had been a burden on my son, if it wasn't true that I had agreed to live in his house because I had nowhere else, if it wasn't true that he had given me money for years. Every question was an attempt to make me look like the villain, but I answered calmly. I told him yes, I had lived in his house, but only after he took my apartment. I told him yes, he had given me money, but it was a fraction of what he had stolen from me. I told him that I was not a burden. I was a mother who had been stolen from and abused by her own son. When I finished testifying, there was a heavy silence in the room. I returned to my seat next to James. He nodded, satisfied. I had done well. The judge took a 2-hour recess to deliberate. We left the room. James bought me a coffee at the courthouse cafeteria. He told me everything had gone perfectly, that there was no way we could lose. I wanted to believe him, but years of disappointment had taught me not to expect anything. 2 hours later, we were called back. The judge already had her decision. We all sat in absolute silence. She began to read. She declared Robert Marquez guilty on all charges: forgery of documents, fraud, misappropriation, elder abuse. The sentence was harsh: 5 years in prison, immediate restitution of all appropriated assets, including the apartment or its equivalent value, payment of $200,000 in additional damages for the suffering caused, prohibition from approaching me for 10 years after serving his sentence. Robert collapsed upon hearing the sentence. His lawyer tried to comfort him, but he just cried with his head in his hands. I looked at that scene without feeling anything, neither joy nor sadness, just a strange emptiness. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring back the lost years. It didn't heal the deep wounds he had opened. We left the courthouse surrounded by journalists. James shielded me from the cameras and microphones. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just wanted to leave there and process what had just happened. I had won, but the victory tasted bitter. 3 weeks after the sentencing, I received the money, $400,000 in total. The value of the apartment Robert had sold, plus the damages the judge had ordered. It was more money than I had seen in my entire life, but it didn't make me happy. It only reminded me of everything I had lost to get it. James helped me open a bank account in my name, only mine. No one else would have access. No one could steal from me again. I deposited the money and stared at the receipt for a long time. Those numbers on the paper represented years of pain, betrayal, and suffering, but they also represented freedom. For the first time in my life, I didn't depend on anyone. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson came to visit me 2 months after the trial. I received them in the small apartment I had rented in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. It had 2 bedrooms, large windows where the sun streamed in, and a kitchen where I could cook whatever I wanted whenever I wanted. Mrs. Wilson cried when she saw me. She hugged me for long minutes without saying anything. Mr. Wilson gave me flowers and a card written in Spanish with the help of a translator. It said he was proud of me, that I had shown more strength than many people half my age, that my story had inspired his own family to value their elders more. During their visit, we had coffee in my small living room. I told them about my new life, how I had started going to a support group for older adults who were victims of family abuse, how I had discovered that my story was not unique, that there were dozens of women like me, stolen from and abandoned by their own children. In that group I met 3 other women: Joanna, 65, whose daughter had stolen her house; Brenda, 70, whose son had left her in a nursing home without ever visiting her; Olivia, 62, whose grandchildren had swindled her with a fake business. We all shared the same pain, the same betrayal, but also the same determination to rebuild ourselves. Together we decided to create something, a foundation to help other older adults in similar situations. I contributed part of my money. They contributed their time and experience. We got a small office where we offered free legal advice, emotional support, and a safe space for people to tell their stories without being judged. Mr. Wilson offered to help with international contacts. He said cases of abandonment in foreign countries were more common than people thought, that we could create a support network that crossed borders. Mrs. Wilson donated money to the foundation and promised to visit us once a year to see how we were doing. We called it Dignity Rising. Every name represented what we were all looking for: not revenge, not pity, just the opportunity to rebuild our lives with the dignity our families had taken from us. The first few months were difficult. We attended to few people, but little by little the word spread. Older women and men arrived with heartbreaking stories, children who had emptied their bank accounts, grandchildren who had convinced them to sign papers they didn't understand, entire families who had erased them from their lives once they were no longer useful. To each one, we offered the same thing that had been offered to me: listening without judgment, legal support, a path toward justice, and above all, the certainty that they were not alone, that their pain was valid, that they deserved to be treated with respect regardless of their age. 6 months after the sentencing, Robert wrote me a letter from prison. I received it but didn't open it for 2 weeks. When I finally did, I found 5 pages of apologies. He said he had had time to reflect, that he understood the magnitude of what he had done, that if he could go back in time, he would change everything. I read the letter once, then I put it away in a drawer. I didn't tear it up or throw it away. I simply put it away. Maybe someday I would have the strength to forgive him. Maybe not. But that decision I would make in my own time, on my own terms. I no longer lived to the rhythm that others set for me. I decided not to answer the letter. Silence was my answer. Robert would have 5 years in prison to think about what he had done. I would use that time to build something that mattered, to help others, to give meaning to my pain. A year after the trial, I sold the rights to the apartment that had been returned to me. I didn't want to go back to that place full of bitter memories. With that money, I bought a small house on the outskirts of the city. It had a garden where I planted flowers and vegetables. Every morning I got up early to water them and watch them grow. It was my way of remembering that I was also growing again. The foundation was prospering. We already had 10 volunteers and had helped over 50 people recover what had been stolen from them. Some cases were small, others as big as mine. But every victory, regardless of its size, was celebrated. Every person who recovered their dignity was a reminder of why we were doing this. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson visited me every 6 months. Olivia came once and spent a week with me. She helped me paint the foundation's walls and organize files. She told me she was studying social work now, that she wanted to dedicate her life to helping others, that I had inspired her. Her words filled me with a pride I had never felt with Robert. At 68 years old, I had built a life I never imagined possible. It wasn't the life I had planned when I was young. It wasn't the life I dreamed of when I raised my son. It was something completely different. It was a life born of pain, but molded by strength. A life where I mattered, where my voice was heard, where my decisions were respected. Every night, before sleeping, I sat on my porch and looked at the stars. I thought about the entire journey, from that cold bench in a foreign country to this warm porch at my own house. The journey had been brutal. It had broken me in ways I was still discovering. But it had also taught me something fundamental, that it is never too late to start over, that dignity is not something others give you, it is something you claim, that true love does not humiliate or destroy, it builds and frees, and that sometimes the families you find along the way are more valuable than the families you were born into. My story did not end with a hug of reconciliation with my son. It did not end with mutual forgiveness and tears of joy. It ended with me, sitting on my porch, in my own house, living by my own rules. And that, I discovered, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.